So welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so glad to be talking with you, Joan. I think the last time I actually saw you live was walking past where I used to live in the Berkeley Hills, where I would see you go by, and what always struck me was this joy that you were carrying. You had a smile on your face, and that always delighted me. Uh, and so
Thank
I'm
you.
glad to see you here, and I'm glad for everybody here. Joyce, welcome. Marty, thank you for popping over to this link. Susan, Gilbert, Victor, old and dear friend and longtime
Colleague and comrade,
colleague and comrade and
comrade in the struggle.
torchbearer of so many important things. So we're here to talk with Dr. Joan Steinau Lester, prolific writer and longtime, decades long activist in the struggle for gender and racial and other forms of justice. And we're here to talk about her latest book, which is a memoir entitled Loving Before Loving, A Marriage in Black and White. And I got a tantalizing note from you, Joan, just before the I called her a tease because she wouldn't tell me what it was, but the book was nominated for yet another award. And I wonder if you want to mention that
I
before we
was
get
really
into
excited. I found out just yesterday that I'm a finalist for something called the Forward Indies Memoir Award. And the reason that it's kind of especially special is that the judges are librarians and booksellers. And I think if there are two pure professions in the world, it's probably as booksellers and librarians.
Indeed.
And so their opinion means a great deal to me.
Yes.
And we'll find out in June whether I actually get the gold star, but I got the silver one yesterday, and that is the second thing that I've been nominated for as a finalist. So I'm excited that this book is touching a nerve with people.
I was especially struck, and I'm here to give you 5 gold stars right now, because this is one of only 2 books in my life where immediately upon finishing the book, I started to read it again because I didn't want it to end.
Oh.
And what I so appreciate about it, Joan, is how you really let the reader into your life. It kind of felt like we were there with you along the way, and also living into some of the struggles. And I think it was because you put yourself, often your body, on the line in, you know, the lunch counter protests and police coming into your home. And that's something that's always been so frightening to me. And it's such a way of kind of stepping outside of the privilege that we have as light-skinned people of European descent, aka white people. We have the privilege to not do that if we so choose. And I'm really, and there are many times when I have chosen not to put my body on the line. I'm really curious about your choices to do that, if it felt natural and organic to you, if you had to push yourself, because in the books it seemed like it was just what you needed to do, like you just did it.
It never occurred to me not to. I never thought about physical danger. And I think that is partly a function of being young. I do now. I do go occasionally still and put my body out there, but I'm very aware, like, oh my God, if I fall at 81, it's not going to be a pretty picture for me. So, but at the time, it was just, I never gave it a second thought, the physical danger. In fact, I'm just so interested that you even bring it up, because certainly writing the book, that never occurred to me. There was never a question of not doing any of those things. It was very natural, the way you just instinctively act if you see something that's wrong. And I do have to say that I grew up in a family of outliers to some extent. So
how so?
They There was a college called Black Mountain College that not a lot of people know about today, but a lot of artists, dancers and writers know about it. It was in Asheville, North Carolina. And in the 30s, it was started in 1933 as a very experimental, free and wild sort of college where the students literally physically built the buildings. And my parents, both coming from impoverished backgrounds in various parts of the country, managed, like my father hitchhiked there, my mother took a bus from California. They had read about it. And they both came in the mid-30s to that school. And I was born there in 1940 in Asheville, North Carolina at Black Mountain College. And it's kind of a symbol of art. I mean, people like Cunningham and I don't know, Buckminster Fuller was there later, and people who were, especially in the arts, but not only, who were free thinkers, I guess you would say. And so my parents absorbed all of that, and that's how they raised, their family, 3 children. And we were always kind of oddballs in town, I think. We lived in small towns, and we had friends, but I always felt different. In the 1940s, when all the other mothers were wearing print dresses, my mother wore we called them dungarees. And she had her dungarees rolled to her knees and long, straight black hair down her back. She was very young. She was 20 when I was born, and she always looked very young, and they were just different. Yeah. And the kind of sense of morality they raised me with was different. I don't have this in the book, but in about 1948, so shortly after World War II, when the NAACP and other organizations had formed what they call the Double V campaign, which was, we got victory against the fascists, now we're going to have victory against discrimination at home. And partly because of that, and so returning vets, were saying like, hey, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And they were sometimes met at train stations by mobs of white people, yes, you are, nothing has changed here, boy. So I'm giving you that context. So in 1948, when I was 8, we lived in a small town in New Jersey, and there was a YMCA conference, I guess, in town. And this African-American, called Negro then, so I use that language in the book, this Black young man who was probably about 13 or 14 was coming to the conference, and he was coming from out of town, I don't know where, and it lasted for a few days, and nobody would put him up. And my parents, even though we weren't members of the Y, somehow they heard about it. So he came and stayed, and they invited him, and he stayed at our house. And I just remember the terror. My parents were afraid our house would be bombed. And then.
Wait, I want to be clear. So you're saying they were afraid not of this young man, but of the backlash?
No, not of the young man at all.
White people,
terrified of the white town's reaction, because 1948, it's hard to even convey to people today who weren't alive then the extent of segregation. Just think of apartheid, everything you've read about South Africa, and that's the way it was. When I think of my block, my street, my neighborhood, my town, it was white people. So there he was in our house for maybe 3 days. And before he came, my parents said to me and my younger brother, who's a couple of years younger than me, so I'm 8, he's 5, just act natural. And of course, they're like quaking in their boots, like, just act natural, which was almost impossible to do. So it was a very fraught moment, but it also taught me a lot about courage. And, you just do what's right, even if you're afraid. As it happened in all of the incidents that I recount of demonstrations, and even the time the police burst into my apartment and kicked everybody out, and I got evicted. I was never afraid.
Wow. Wow. So go ahead.
I just wasn't.
Yeah. So can I ask about that very vulnerable moment that led you to try to take your life in the context of being, I guess most people would say strong. For you, it seemed like just normal. This is just what you do. You show up, you do what's right.
Mhm.
And I get being so young and being in charge of these troubled girls. I'm holding these two things in my mind of
Mhm. Mhm.
what pulled you into your deepest vulnerability and despair, and what you do, like it was picking up the groceries, what other people would find terrifying. Um,
That I
so
stick my head in an oven because,
yeah,
I was thinking about that. I've thought about it a lot, and especially since I wrote the memoir. I was 18.
yeah.
And for those who haven't read the book, I was working at a home for troubled teenage girls. I was a live-in counselor, and it was a very messed up place. The other live-in counselor with me, there were just 5 or 6 girls. The other counselor, again, this wasn't all that long after the war, was a Polish refugee, and she threw up after every meal in the bathroom, made herself throw up. And I had never heard of that behavior before, and it was rather startling. And she was just a very unhappy woman. And there I was at 18, and I had signed on for 6 months. It was I was at Antioch College, and it was part of a job. You work for 6 months, and then you're in school for 6 months, and so I had signed up. And I was thinking about it, it seems odd now, but as a teenager, and it was so awful for me being there, I didn't know how to quit. I just couldn't walk away. I didn't think it was something I could do. And it was so unbearable that after 4 months there, and I was having so much fights with the director about the girls. Let's say there were 6, there were 5 who were white and 1 who was African-American. And she was treated very differently on Saturdays, when all the girls got to go out to a lunch and a movie from this, really kind of barred place. It was almost a prison, very claustrophobic atmosphere. And we never left the building practically. So on Saturdays, it was a huge event. But they only took the white girls. They would not take this Black girl. And when I confronted the director, now remember, this is 1957, 58. She said, "Joan, you don't even understand. This is in Evanston, Illinois." So kind of I think of it as an upper middle class white suburb where this home was. And she said, "You don't understand. If anybody saw her and knew that she was living here, we could be in big trouble." And I said, "But you're just this awful. The girls talk about this all week. They're excited it's coming up, and then afterwards, the movie they saw, the lunch, and it's just awful." And I had to stay back with this girl who was sobbing all the time, and I just felt so helpless and terrible that I couldn't even make her life better. And I understand now. I understand the director's position as an administrator in deepest segregation. And she said, this girl's lucky to be here. Her father raped her, like all the girls' fathers had practically. Anyway, yeah. So I just felt so powerless, I guess, to change anything. My circumstances, her circumstance or mine. That it was the only way out. And I've certainly thought about it. It was a rather extreme reaction to try to kill myself. But it worked. It was kind of magical. I don't know why the gas didn't kill me. And I've been grateful for that ever since. It didn't. And I've had an amazing life since then. So I'm grateful.
So glad.
Yeah, thank you. I am too. And it says to me something about teenagers too. And I don't know, I have been strong and powerful in a lot of ways, and I didn't have the agency then to dare to quit and leave, because I kept trying to change the place and I couldn't. And I didn't have the agency to leave. And one thing was that for every week you worked, you got 1 credit, a college credit toward your graduation. This was the beginning of my 2nd year of college. And I didn't want to lose all those credits. Of course, in the end, because I quit, the woman denied me. She flunked me, the director of the house, so that I didn't get any credits anyway. I don't know what else to say about it.
Thank you, Joan. I mean, the word that strikes me that you use is helplessness or powerlessness. And as a teenager, we don't know all of our options. We're still a kid. And throughout your life, you have found, so many alternatives. Okay, so the police storm your house, you got evicted. What's next? And you get like a more of a core sense of yourself, and also that there's possibility around you. So that it makes sense to me. And as forward thinking and as much outliers as your parents were, I think correct me if I'm not remembering the exact details of the book, but when you and Julius did get involved, it was not completely smooth sailing. Is that right?
Absolutely. No, they well, partly because I had committed suicide, and I'd also just recently had an illegal abortion. When I met Julius, was 21, and I moved in with him when I was 22. And, again, this is 1962. And we think now of the 60s as, oh, they were such a liberated time, but in the early 60s, they still weren't, and my father's from Kentucky, my mother's from California. But anyway, my mother came to my apartment in New York where I was living with Julius, because I had told them I'm getting married. And they said, no, we can't support this. We were considering, this is amazing to me, committing you to a mental institution because you're going to do this. What? I mean, it was just bizarre. And here these very liberal parents
who'd been the ones to invite the young Black man into their home. Almost like you were following their lead of, we consider humans as humans in this house.
But they're like, you don't know what you're getting into. It's going to be terrible for the children. That's what everybody said then. They used this awful word, mulatto. Then you'd have mulatto children, and you don't know how bad it would be for them, and they don't have a place, and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, that's what they did. They did not come. And Julius's parents also did not come. They had a very bad reaction, because from a different point of view, both parents felt that it was dangerous for us, both sets. So Julius's parents were saying, oh, don't mess with white girls. People got lynched. I mean, Emmett Till had only been, that was 1954. This is 1962, had only been 8 years before. I mean, so his parents were like, no way, this is dangerous. Don't do this. So nobody came to my brother. It was really sweet. He was like 19 or something. He hitched there, and he came.
Wedding.
Yeah, our wedding with like 5 people. We had a few people from Antioch College, and somebody, one friend of Julius's. So.
Yeah. Wow. And another thing that strikes me is that you can be transgressive in one way. I mean, like I love the whole trajectory of facing racism and white supremacy, and having that be so much in your face because of being adjacent to Julian and being so intimately involved with him. Sorry, Julius.
That's okay.
And but that didn't stop or prevent some of the gender stereotypical things that you had to face, and there was a whole other arc that kind of came in after
Mhm.
the arc of racial awareness.
Which was really the arc nationally. The civil rights movement, if we want to say it started, in the 50s with the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, this wave of it had always been going with Southern farmers organizing. I mean, there'd been lots of waves, but what we came to know of as the civil rights movement of the 60s really started in the 50s with the Montgomery bus boycott, I think in 57. And the nation getting riveted to that in Birmingham, and hoses on children, and a national awareness.
Yeah.
And out of that, it was really women, Black women and white women, who were involved in the civil rights movement. And there we, weren't really thinking about our own liberation. We were just also horrified by segregation, and at the beginning it was legal segregation. That was what we were fighting about. And who knew that it was so much more, that the tentacles were so much deeper. But we weren't thinking about it. And it was only in about 67 that some of us made the analogy. And oh my goodness, we started to look at like newspaper ads then for jobs. Help wanted, male and female. And they were completely different kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
And we started to look at everything with new eyes and understand the way we had begun to understand the internalized oppression. We were reading Fanon and Baldwin, and the internalized oppression of African Americans. We began to apply that to ourselves finally. I was like, oh my gosh, we have internalized this mentality that we are lesser and we aren't deserving. And I mean, it wasn't that we didn't have some feelings before, but it just burst out. And I think everybody, I just saw a chat, who was the first, Fanon, Frantz Fanon, the was he Algerian? Somebody can help me here. He wrote when he was in Nigeria. I don't think he was a Nigerian. I'm sorry, Algerian author.
I think it's from Martinique.
I was just going to say, I thought
Caribbean.
he was Caribbean. Yes.
Yeah.
But he wrote a lot about internalized oppression that was, mind blowing to us. We were just like absorbing his work. So where was I? Oh, but in terms of our own understanding about what we had either accepted or we'd been protesting, but on an individual level, we each thought it was our own problem. Why can't I work this out with my male partner? What is it about me? And it's only once we started telling our stories to each other that we realized, oh my God, this is everybody. When we say, why aren't you doing some of the housework? They're like, housework, that is trivial bullshit. What are you talking about? We're out here fighting for our rights out there. You want to bring up housework? And, but we were all getting the exact same kind of pushback. So we began to get together and organize in the late 60s. And I talk a lot about that then, the 67, 68, but that really, and then that helped propel this wave of the women's movement, which again, like the civil rights movements of the past, this wasn't the first one. I mean, it's really amazing to read about what women did fighting for suffrage. And, there've been waves of women all along.
Yes. Sorry, and I took my video off so I could sneeze. Yes. And I, in college, I read about these things in theory, like quote unquote, first wave, or maybe was it second wave, about consciousness raising groups and the power of naming and the moment of noticing that you have the same experience of everyone else. And so when I read your personal experience and saw some of the names there, like Ty Grace Atkinson, and like some of these names that I had heard about, it was like being transported back into the actual
Yeah.
phenomenon as it was
Right.
unfolding. So that was
Yeah. Tea
quite
Grace. She and
exciting. Yeah.
yeah. I have a whole anecdote there where she's really busting me.
And so Santa, hi Santa, thank you for joining us. I'm glad you could be here. She says, though there is controversy about whether there is a third wave and if it isn't just a white woman's movement.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of controversy at the time about that. Is this a white, you're thinking about housework, we're trying to stay alive and people are raping us on the streets and we can't, our wages are half of yours and et cetera. So there were definitely differential pressures on women and differential movements, but there were a lot of women. Frances Beale was a friend of mine who's one of the founders of the Third World Women's Alliance, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, whom I write about a lot in the book, who was a close friend of mine, was very active as a Black woman. And there were a number of Black women, especially women who'd been in the civil rights movement, who were making those same analogies and were organizing. But like everything else in the women's movement, I mean, there was definitely the white leadership in what some of us knew as the women's movement, although there was a somewhat parallel Black women's movement. But there was definitely racism in the movement and it was being called out a lot.
Actually, I was talking about, is there a third wave? And yeah, and more about the more current thing.
Oh, well, the women now are rocking it. I mean, Black Lives Matter, that was 3 women who, started the slogan and, sort of picked up from Occupy and a lot of other movements. And the leadership, I mean, that is so different now. When at the time in the 60s, when I was so active then, as it was all male leadership. We had rap, we had Stokely, we had, all the, we had Martin Luther King, we had all these guys. And there were no women in national leadership. And now, Black women, and there's Kamala Harris, and there are just a lot of Black women are in leadership in a lot of places. I mean, it's wonderful.
So Joan, I want to talk a bit about allyship and paradox, and then open it up more for what might be on other folks' mind. You brought the poem by Pat Parker, which I'm fond of talking with other white people about. I think, in allyship and co-conspiratorhood and being an anti-racist white person. And by the way, I chose the word proculturators because I took very seriously Resmaa Menakem's call to white people to create anti-racist white culture. Resmaa Menakem is the author of My Grandmother's Hands and also The Quaking of America, which is either just out or going to be out very soon. And the anti something to create anti was kind of sticking in my craw. And political strategists of all stripes know very well that people rally around a pro something much more than the anti something, which is why anti-abortionists created the pro-life movement, and anti-same-sex marriage folks created the Defense of Marriage Act. When people put forth an anti something, they make a proposition, they preemptively make a proposition that makes it sound like they're for something. So I dug up this word from a Georgian academic, not Georgia in the United States, but an Eastern country, and had used in a sort of sociological context, pro-culturate, to create this culture. And that, Joan, that is what you have done with so much of your work and your life choices. And when I work with other anti-racist white people, a lot of times people ask, well, what should I do in this situation? Or how do I behave here? And you're sort of looking for an algorithm, a way to behave, as opposed to kind of being with what sometimes are sticky situations, and bring our full humanity to it. And Res Momenticum has highlighted this trend, which I am so happy about, of doing our inner work, of being able to be with hard stuff, healing our wounds, working with our trauma, healing our hurts, so that when this incredibly complex and deeply rooted hurt of historical and current white supremacy mythology and racism manifests themselves, we have the inner resources to be with it, to work with it. And that sometimes has us in paradoxical situations. And that first line of the poem, which I'll let you read, and it really speaks to that. Do you still want to?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I'm thinking as you're talking too, that this is, it's about race, but I think we could also make the analogy to gender.
Mm-hmm.
And, this could, if we change the words a little, it could be, because the title is For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend, by the marvelous Pat Parker, who died, I think, in the 80s, a Black lesbian poet from San Francisco, who was just wonderful. But we also could say, instead of for the white person who wants to know how to be my friend, we could say, for the man who wants to know how to be my friend. And I know Victor, I'm looking at his picture there. He's done a huge amount of work on gender allyship. Okay, but what Pat Parker says in this poem is, the first thing you do is to forget that I'm Black. Second, you must never forget that I'm Black. You should be able to dig Aretha, but don't play her every time I come over. And if you decide to play Beethoven, don't tell me his life story. They made us take music appreciation too, and so on. But yeah, she gets at that. Yeah,
and it reminds me of I was traveling in Germany and Austria and Switzerland in the early 90s, and I met a German man, and I thought, this guy's not going to get me in any way, shape, or form. He's not going to get my Jewishness. He's not going to get that I'm a feminist, all these things. But what the heck? I'm just going to have fun with him anyway. And there was this moment where, and we were in France, and there's this moment when a bottle of wine came to the room, and I was sitting there struggling, trying to open it. And he was just sitting there, and he wasn't doing anything, wasn't saying anything. And all of a sudden he kind of exploded. And he said, I want to help you with this wine, but I'm afraid if I offer to help you, you think you can, because you're a feminist and you're going to think that I'm trying to take over for you, but you're struggling with the wine. I really want to drink some of the wine.
That's a great example. Yeah, exactly. So, exactly. Well, should we open it now to sort of general questions and discussion? I'd love to hear from others and questions
and send to ask, what was the title of the Pat Parker poem?
The title is For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend. And it's just delightful. Eat soul food if you like it, but don't expect me to locate your restaurants or cook it for you. Yeah, and she was wonderful. It was really sad when she died. And she wasn't that old when she died. Maybe, I don't know, maybe in her 50s, maybe 60, just barely.
Well, I need to depart shortly, but I wanted to make an observation and reflection of kinship. I went to a little free high school called the Cleveland Urban Learning Community. And a lot of my classmates went to Antioch, or they went to Hampshire or Goddard, and we, talked about Summerhill and Black Mountain School, and read Paul Goodman and Yvonne Illich and Buckminster Fuller, and Marshall McLuhan, and then when the feminist book wave hit, we just ran through each. Sisterhood is Powerful, Robin Morgan, Shalama's Firestone, Mary Daly, then Michelle Wallace, Alice Walker, and This Bridge Called My Back folks. And um, I'm appreciating that being in an alternative educational context, growing up kind of as education radicals, did something to all of our other progressive politics that has always left me feeling a kinship with you. But I didn't know about your Black Mountain Antioch background. But as soon as you started talking, I'm like, oh, of course.
Of course, as you and I always felt that with you, but I didn't know all of that. I didn't know any of those pieces. So that's wonderful.
It's a tiny tidbit. I got my understanding of anti-war politics and imperialism because my homeroom teacher at the hippie high school that I went to was one of the organizers of the Kent State rally, May 4th, 1970, against the war in Vietnam that resulted in the massacre of 4 of his friends. So for field trips, we went to the 5th anniversary of the massacre. He invited his comrades over who'd gotten to as a guest speaker with this guy named Robbie who got shot in the face. So all the historical stuff was very close and vivid, and we saw consciousness raising, feminist second wave consciousness raising at our school, and all the people with penises were going, whoa, 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 whoa. We were excited, but it was fucking terrifying too.
Yeah. All the above. All the
women would go into a room and they would talk and they'd come out fuming, and we're like, oh my God, the gig is up.
And it was. Oh, well, I'm sorry you have to leave, but it's just so delightful. And so before you leave, for you, Victor, I have to plug my memoir in case you haven't got it, because I talk about Summerhill, because I started a school based on Summerhill principles, and half the books that you just mentioned are all in the memoir. So I think you will feel it. It's very
yeah. So
You can borrow my copy.
No, I want my own, of course.
Buy your own copy.
Look behind me.
And if you email me your address, if you want, I'll send you a book plate. I've been doing that with people since I can't sign books in person. I haven't been doing bookstore sign.
Oh, wonderful.
So
thank you. Great to hear your story.
Yeah, likewise, and great to see you.
Good to see you, Victor. Oh, he's gone.
I got a question, Joan, too, and it goes back to the early 60s. And again, it's just the thought, and I thought about it after I read your book. I thought about it after I read Hester Hetty Jones's book and other memoirs and other people of the early 60s, in terms of what role, I guess, do you think of Malcolm X playing, because there seems to be a really heavy tie with all of the men that were married to white women at the time, that they gravitated, and rightly so. Like, this is not judgmental, it's just an observation. But what role did all of Black power play at a very early age? And you were in your 20s, I was in my 20s, Hetty was in her 20s. I mean, all of that time, location, and being in New York. So I just wonder whether or not you ever thought about that role in any kind of way.
Well, I do talk in the memoir about pressures on Black men who were in the movement, who were married to white women, as you well know.
Right.
There was a huge amount of pressure from their comrades saying, you're talking Black but sleeping white. That was the biggest sin, or not the biggest sin, but it was a sin. And that was a lot of pressure.
What about with Malcolm X directly?
Malcolm X. Well, we loved him. I loved him.
Right, myself too.
Yeah. I mean, we just thrilled to him and wanted to hear all his speeches, and was devastated when he was assassinated. I mean, he was such a brilliant man. And
I didn't know he was married to a white woman. Was that in the movie?
wait,
Was it-
Malcolm X?
No, he wasn't.
Oh, oh, I
He-
thought you were saying he was married to a white woman.
No, I was saying for those of us who
Not
were,
you, but Joyce, but
what Joyce was, yeah, and I was married to black men, so yeah. No, I don't think he was,
okay.
but he
It's-
was just such
No,
a
not that I know of.
brilliant, such a brilliant thinker. You know, he just made things very clear. He didn't mess around.
Yeah.
I always remember when he said, "What's a black PhD in Mississippi?"
Right.
N-word. And, you know, that just kind of laid it out there. You just, well, like Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast, you know, talking about you're branded. And so that's what we're really dealing with. And how do we keep moving to undo the brand? The New York Times front page today has a story about, which I'm glad to see on the front page because I've been hearing about it, but it's still hard to read, the differential treatment of African students, medical students. There were a lot of them in Ukraine. And as they're also trying to get out of the country at the Polish border, they're being beaten up by Ukrainian guards and Polish guards. And I mean, they're just being threatened, their lives. And, you know, it's a very different reception than white Ukrainians are getting.
Are you
when
saying they're black Ukrainians or they're
Well,
from?
they're medical students. They're not necessarily, they're not Ukrainians, but they've been living there.
Okay.
And there have been a lot of them, I guess. I mean, it's always so interesting what you learn in these kind of situations. A lot of medical students and other graduate students are there. I mean, thousands. And they've been having a terrible time trying to get out. They're holding them at the border. They won't let them out because the other countries won't let them in either. I mean, it's more of part of the same
Wow.
of the kind of discrimination that migrants and refugees have been getting from the Middle East and North Africa, you know, for years now. But it's you know, it's just so stark now because they're both coming from, they're fleeing the same war this time.
Yeah.
So that, you know, we have our work cut out for us. And yet I have to say, you know, the one way that I keep hopeful is there it is on the front page of the New York Times. And I don't think years ago that it wouldn't have been so visible. And that's not the first article I've read about that differential, really horrible treatment in the New York Times and in other news platforms.
Yeah.
I
Welcome,
think
David. But I just want to say welcome to David, who joined us.
Who is that?
That's David, my life
Hello.
partner, and he often does tech for these things. But we're a small enough group that we won't need to go into breakout rooms. So his job
Okay,
may be very
I'm not
easy.
seeing him on the screen. Where are you?
He's in the red shirt. You don't see him?
Oh, okay.
Oh.
I guess my
If-
my
if you
view didn't go that far. Okay, hi.
There's a button in the upper right of your Zoom
I
screen that
just
might
did it.
say
I-
view.
I did,
Got it.
and now I've lost some of the folks, but now I see you in your red shirt. Hi, hi. Okay, so to continue.
Joyce, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that the issue of the African students or African American students that are over in Ukraine, that was in the news about maybe a week or so, maybe even longer, where they were on two separate lines and they weren't allowed on the trains. That's how I first became aware of it. And I was just, again, horrified by it because there it is again, all over again in a obviously a different way, but the same issue right on top of it, you know, but those train lines were just awful.
Yeah.
And there was there was an article in the Amsterdam News. My friend Susan, who's on here, ever since I've been down south, I've gotten the Amsterdam News to keep me up to date with New York, but they also have an international page, and they broke this story even before CNN. So it was really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, no, so we have to be grateful that at least the news is out there, because
Yeah.
before, hi, Naomi came back.
Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
So, before, especially this recent wave of visibility because of Black Lives Matter and because of the murder in May of, what was that, 2020, the latest, and, that got so much visibility of George Floyd, but the stuff is being reported, and I think there's more public acknowledgement. So that always makes me feel you have to have some kind of visibility for people to engage in this, and it just keeps lifting awareness of, just we have to keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
It reminds me of I take these little workshops. David White, I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. He's a poet and Irish bard kind of guy, and he does these little 3 weekend talk kind of things. Anyway, this last Sunday he was talking about our human inherent terror of darkness, and that it's not just born out of whole cloth, that actually it's some innate something, fear of the unknown. It kind of represents the fear of the unknown or something like that.
Take issue with that.
Do you?
I do, because
I never quite heard it like that.
I think it kind of resonates with us because we're so used to, because we've been so acculturated to think of darkness as scary and evil. But a friend of mine years ago was writing about this, and she started writing about the fertile dark.
Yeah.
Degenerative dark. That's where
that's what he was
routing.
talking about. Yeah.
And we can look at it so differently. The mysterious dark wonder.
Sure. That's the point he was trying to make,
Okay. That I don't necessarily know if it's innate. I mean, the fact that we would associate the unknown with a skin color. I think we've learned to see.
Well, not necessarily a skin color before that, just with darkness. Dark, fear of the night, fear of what we can't see, fear of what we.
Well, I mean, that may be there. We certainly have.
But maybe it's too big of a leap to bring it to skin color. Then you go somewhere else.
I really do, and I base that partly on the response of young children who, the old thing about the song, if we have to be carefully taught to, to see the differences, because young children to us in this culture, every, representation of whether it's Blackness or people of color, small bodily things, are so salient. But to young children, they aren't. They might look at something else and look at, the color of your shoes or something. And
right.
Say, we're exactly alike. And we could look at the two people. Well, how could you say that? That person is dark color and this person is light. But
right. But they might be afraid of going to sleep with the light off, It might
exactly. But I don't necessarily know that we would be making that link to people.
Right. I agree with that.
If it weren't convenient and handy to have an excuse to have.
I'm wondering, this might be a stupid question, but or
no stupid
ignorant
question. Before you go, Santa,
okay.
David, were you raising your hand and unmuting because you wanted to say something?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I was thinking, I wasn't even. Yeah, I was thinking that a lot of what you said, so that's why I stopped. put my hand down, but I think we're wired to get knowledge from our parents when we're really young. We have to trust them to survive. And so they will tell us things like, stay away from that dark place at night because there could be snakes or scorpions or scary things out there. So we get some messages that in some contexts, dark is bad, but because we're wired that way, as a young kid, we don't know the difference between stay away from the dark blackness because there's spiders there, and stay away from that dark black person because of whatever reason they come up with. As a child, it's just knowledge we're getting from our culture and parents. We don't know the difference. We're kind of wired to accept it to survive. And I think some of that is beneficial, and it's the harmful parts that we have to learn to weed out without throwing out the good stuff too. Like not all black is good, or black isn't black and white.
Okay. Naomi has an interesting comment in the chat. Yes, about the children must be carefully taught. And I refer to that song in my book. What is your book?
Yes, no, I was actually so thrilled to hear you make reference to it because, so my book is entitled Strength of Soul. It was published April 2019 by Two Leaf Press and distributed by University of Chicago Press. And I have a very sort of different take on a lot of these issues, and I'm staying off camera just because I don't want to be recorded with my face, but nevertheless, I have a different take because I am of multi-ethnic heritage, white Jewish American father and Ecuadorian mother. And I have one son, the son I had to leave to go pick up from school, who is presumed to be white. My son looks white American. And there are assumptions that are made about us as mother and son stand in stark contrast to the assumptions that were made about me and my white father. And in my work, I'm an educator, I'm an equity practitioner, and I started to see that there was I could see the cracks in the foundation, I guess, because of those vastly different assumptions, right? And so in both assumptions, I'm in the more powerless position. So as a child, it was assumed that my father had adopted me. And as a mother, it's assumed that I am my son's nanny or his caretaker. And I have come to a place where I think so often in the ways that we teach or aim to teach children about racism and identity, we actually solidify the very idea and philosophy of racism itself, the philosophy of white supremacy, the philosophy of anti-Blackness, and this sense that there is an innate or inherent difference between people based on skin color, which for a family like mine is of course untrue, and also easy for us to see how untrue that is, right? My son sees himself in me, I see myself in him, etc. But the ways that we talk about racism so often with each other as adults and certainly with children solidifies this notion that there's an inherent us and them, and that whiteness is sort of this automatic privilege, or that there is automatic privilege and protection and power in whiteness, as opposed to a systemic approach, right? And rather than it being sort of natural and inevitable, it's, we created this system and we perpetuate the system and we adhere to the system. So yes, Joan, I was so thrilled to see you or hear you make reference to that song, because yes, I have an entire chapter, I think, entitled Children Must Be Carefully Taught, right? Because my son, who looks white, does not identify only as white. He sees himself in dark-skinned people. He knows he belongs to them. And he also knows that white supremacy and systemic racism and anti-Blackness are damaging to his psyche as well, right? That it's not only this thing that is damaging to Black and brown people, but is actually damaging to humanity as a whole. So
what is the song that you were talking about?
It's South Pacific, right, Joan? It's South Pacific. Yeah.
It was a musical of the 60s, I think.
Yeah. And it's talking, it's certainly not about racism, but it can be applied to anything about what we want our children to learn and take forward in their adulthood. And I think it is such an apt quote when it comes to discussing inequity, racist inequity and identity with children, right? I mean, I often think that the way we talk about it with kids, we tend to place the emphasis on sort of skin color as the inequity when it's not the skin color, it's the system, right? So my son is now in 6th grade, and when he was in 4th, he was writing an essay for school about Emmett Till, and he wrote Emmett Till was killed because of his skin color. And I had him pause and I said, do you think he was killed because of his skin color or because of racism? And he said, oh, well, that's what the article said. You got very indignant. And I looked at the article with him, and indeed he was right, that that's what the article had said. And so I sat down with my son and I said to him, well, do you think his skin color was a problem? Or do you think that, you know, someone else's racism, someone else's racist ideas and then actions were the problem? And he, you know, he started to think more expansively about what is in fact to blame, right? It's not, I'm walking through the world as a brown woman and that's, you know, unfortunate for me, right? It's more, I'm walking through a white supremacist, anti-Black and racist society, and that's a problem for all of us.
Thank you for that distinction.
I'm glad you brought all that up. And I think I also am a part of a biracial family. And for those of us in those families, all this stuff becomes crystal clear.
Yes, exactly.
There's nothing, genetic about it. There's nothing, blah, 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 biological,
right.
How much it is completely systemic for some people's benefit, they think, but,
Right.
short-term benefit.
Yeah. Susan, you had a thought?
Yeah, it sort of stems back to when you were talking about children are basically accepting of each other. But I started thinking about the research by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who did the research on with Black and white dolls and asked children who they preferred, who was prettier, who was, and the Black children all chose white dolls as nicer, prettier, and people I'd want to be friends with.
Well, they learned. They had been taught. I mean, they see kids are not stupid, and they see very early. I wrote my dissertation on this very topic of racial and gender consciousness formation in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds.
That's right.
Okay, so you know that.
You
know that research.
And they see very young.
I'm sorry. Did I jump in? I got excited. David, were you about to say something? I saw your hand do something. So you did this dissertation. I know you had the school and you founded Equity Consulting. I'm wondering, this body of work that you did in your dissertation, what if anything were the ways that it kind of filtered out into the world? Because now I'm all curious about that.
Well, I think it just reinforced my work with adults that we have to keep getting at all the subtleties, because we've all learned this stuff from a very young age. I've become more aware recently the ways that white supremacy has crept into my brain and heart and soul, when I realized how much part of white supremacy is feeling that we should be in charge of everything because we know best. And I actually wrote a blog. You can go to my blog, joanlester.com, with my blog page, about it recently. When I noticed myself, this is a few years ago, at a choir rehearsal. I was at in Oakland, a women's choir I had been in for many, many, many years, knew the people really well. They're all African-American except for me, including the director and all of the members. And one day the director said, move your chairs, such and such, altos, I want you to move over this side instead of there, and sopranos move here. And, rearrange yourselves. And I heard myself saying to the group, okay, move, sopranos, move over here. I'm like, oh man. And I caught the eye of an African-American woman that I knew quite well. And she looked at me, she sort of gave me the side eye. And I said to her, oh, white people always have to be in charge, don't we? And she said, yeah. So, it filters in to our own expectations about ourselves, even those of us that have been kind of being aware and getting more and more aware over many, many, many decades. So it's there, but so is sexism, but we're not going to just give up on it all and say, well, this has been with us for thousands of years or whatever. And,
Yeah, it's a process.
And things have changed. I mean,
Yeah.
I keep reminding people we don't have legal segregation anymore. And we didn't really have a Black middle class. I mean, this is not to deny that the horrible disparities that still exist, kind of unbelievably, in terms of the generational wealth and the assets held by various ethnic groups in this country, and the systemic stuff that's still going on. In fact, I read an article again in the Times, I think Sunday, in the business section, about people going back, remote workers going back into the office, and women especially, and especially women of color, many times do not want to go back in the office because it was not a welcoming atmosphere for them. It was a white male club in many places. And they much prefer working remotely, partly because they can just focus on the work and not have to deal with all that sort of office politics, which is what we call it, but it's really systemic sexism and racism.
Yeah.
So, but where was I going with this? But, but nonetheless, we are having these conversations publicly, and we don't have legal segregation, and women have made huge advances. I mean, I couldn't even get a driver's license in my own name in the early 1970s. I had to have it in my husband's name, even though I wasn't using that name. Yeah. So, a lot has changed too. And there are so many more biracial families.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody asked.
And not to mention a credit card.
Yeah, not to mention, a credit card.
Naomi is raising her hand. And Susan had a question before that too.
Thank you. Yeah. I wanted to sort of refer as well to Susan's, I think thoughtful question about why, if it's not innate, why would children sort of automatically choose the dolls, right, in that experiment? Mm-hmm. And countless others have taken place since. And how it reminded me that yesterday, actually, there was a post on LinkedIn. A woman wrote about all the ways that our very language solidifies this notion, right, of sort of the goodness of lightness or whiteness and the badness of darkness or blackness. And it reminded me that even when I was young, my white grandfather used to say, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And of course, thinking, right, knowing that meant the prettiest. And I would, excitedly say me and think, it was great. It was very sweet sort of rapport with my grandfather. And only until I was a little older, maybe about 11 or so, did I realize, fairest as a synonym for prettiest, right? And how we I think collectively tend to accept these ideas without even realizing that we're accepting them, right? That there's so many ways that, and this goes for everyone, this is Black and brown and white people alike. I mean, my son, when he was little, a shopkeeper said to me that his skin was so clean. He said it in Spanish. He said, no, su piel es tan limpia, his skin is so clean. And he meant that as an equivalent for light. And I had to, say there's nothing clean about his skin. There's nothing dirty about mine. It's just he's light and I'm not, right? Like just that there's so many ways that this is embedded, and that if you're not intentional in seeing that and understanding that and then transmitting that, right, to your children or whoever in your life, it just perpetuates,
Yeah, I think there's a lot more awareness now about language than there was 50 years ago. I do have a long perspective on this, but remember flesh-colored Band-Aids?
That's right.
On one skin tone, as if that's the norm.
That's right.
And that has changed. And the same with crayons, also had flesh-colored crayons. That's right. So, bit by bit, but, it's like.
And Susan asked, how much of your research is related to biracial kids?
It wasn't directly related, but there's certainly an implication, because just like Naomi's son, biracial kids have dual heritages. And if they, there are a lot of different combinations of parentage, but if one is from a member of a dominant group, they have an interesting kind of conundrum. And of course, in the United States, if there's any visible or acknowledged dark ancestry or African American, whether or not it's a skin tone, the public will primarily recognize that child as a member of that group, and the white heritage will be more invisible.
What were the hardest parts for you in raising biracial kids?
What were the what?
The hardest
hardest
parts.
Oh my gosh. One thing I have to say, I can't really talk much about my kids. They're now in their mid-50s. They have instructed me not to speak for them. And their father
Well, I asked about you. What were the hardest parts for you?
No, but as I think about it, I have to be careful. I'm just saying that because their father was a writer and now I'm a writer, and we've both been writing, a lot about anecdotes from our own lives.
Don't talk about me.
Include them, exactly. Well, for me, like Naomi, people didn't presume that I was the parent of them if I was alone. And if Julius was with us, it was really confusing to people, although they might add it all up more quickly. But yeah, that's why I'm so glad to see more and more biracial families. At the time in 1962, when I got married, I think something like 0.01% of families of, people married somebody from another ethnic group. So that has definitely changed in the last 60 years.
By the way, somebody messaged me earlier today and said, effectively, why don't you do any programs about biracial people? Because everything seems to be for Black or white. And I was like, that's a great idea. I said, I'm going to be tapering off programs this year because Cleo Monago and I are going to start our 22nd Century Leaders program for white anti-racist folks. That's going to be starting in April. And normally what I do is I stop doing the shorter programs for a period of time because it's a lot of work and we're focusing on the longer program. And I said, but I believe she was biracial herself. And I said, if you feel inspired to this, I'll support you. I'll, help you in any way you want. So it seems like there's a need for this, an interest in it. And so I just want to say I'm all for that, and I'll help in any way that I can. If somebody wants to.
I have a book. My book, Black, White, Other, is a novel. So I have written some novels as well as other nonfiction books, and that is exactly about that. It's a teen novel about a teen girl who is struggling with her identity.
If Susan is still on, she told me she does a lot of work with camps and camping, but there is a camp that is, I think, if she's on, maybe she can clear it up, but I think it's only for biracial kids who are struggling with issues of identity. And they go away for X amount of weeks during the summer, and they have workshops and things of that nature.
One of the camps that I saw was not only for biracial kids, but it was for biracial Jewish kids who were dealing with all of those issues together.
Yeah, and there have been some good books in recent years by biracial people about their both fiction and nonfiction. There's a whole body of work now. We're moving along, folks. We are moving in this arena. Stuff is happening a lot.
Yes. David says,
we haven't even mentioned, younger people. Yeah, I steer away from biracial too. I know I try to say ethnic. People of different ethnic groups or different ethnic backgrounds.
Mixed blood.
Yeah. That's right.
Solidifies that there are different races.
Right. Exactly. You said it.
I would just want to say before we close something about younger people. There's just amazing things that young people are doing. Well, Naomi, you're probably a representative here of a new generation.
I don't know how young I am. I just had my 44th.
Well,
So
you're young.
but I guess younger, but
Yeah, but that's great what you're doing. You know, I cheer you on, and people even younger than you. I mean, there's just amazing things. I know so many young people, especially young Black people who went to Ferguson as organizers after Mike Brown was killed and have been very involved in Black Lives Matter, and just they're just doing some amazing stuff, and they're so open, and they're doing at the same time, they're also just so much more aware of male supremacy and so many women in leadership. So I think, you know, we can pass on the baton and know that, you know, people are really out there going way beyond what we've done.
My son actually spoke out at Berkeley High School when he was a senior about a year and a half ago. There was an alleged rape on campus, and the administration had a pretty tepid response. And so the students staged a walkout, and they had a rally, and there's just a small handful of young men who spoke. There were lots of women. And he got up and he said, you know, I have younger female cousins who are coming to Berkeley High in a few years, and I want to be able to look them in the eye and say, we did everything we could. So, you know, calling upon the administration to do more. And I was like, so proud. I just, you know,
Yeah.
I didn't know that he had gotten it to that degree.
He got it.
He did.
He got it. Good job.
So does anyone, we're going to try to wind up by 1:30. I think we said we were going to try to wind up by 1:20. Now we're over. Does anybody have any final burning thoughts or praise or songs or questions for our esteemed guest? Yes, Cinta.
I hope you win your award.
Oh,
That's my
thank you.
wish.
Thank you, Joyce.
I was just kind of thinking, I live in the North Bay area in a kind of, there's very few Blacks, it's more Hispanic, but outside Sonoma, and then Sonoma itself is pretty white, wine growers and things like this. But I'm wondering, it seems like there's a kind of separatism in the movement, you know, the racial awareness kind of thing. There's still some kind of separation. Like, I want to go live with Black people or something, you know. It's like, how do you immerse yourself in something? And I do have one answer to that. Or create a world, or find a world, a way of working with, you know, BIPOC, other races. And it might not be an issue in some places, but I am a member of this community, online community with Reverend Angel. And that's about the only one I know that is actually has a vision and is creating this vision of people working together, where you can go to the White Caucus and do your white work, you know, your white, or you can do these things that are mixed. Am I making?
Well, yes, you are. I think it's a great question. One of the things I often encourage people to do, and something I have done in my own life, is to find organizations that are led by especially people of color, if it's white people that are wanting to get more involved with people of color and make friendships and be involved in, you know, a cause or something. But they're out there. There are lots of organizations, and it might not necessarily be a civil rights organization. It might be a spiritual organization. Yeah. For instance, I'm a member of a spiritual organization in Oakland that I've been a member of for 30 years, this choir that I was talking about before, where I was, you know.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah. that is a Black-led organization with, you know, spiritual principles that are very compatible with me. We'd call them New Age, I think, New Thought, but they're spiritual, you know, whether it's whatever, a sport or, you know,
Okay. I think
crocheting or gardening, or, you know, there are organizations in any field that you're interested in.
okay.
Okay, or voting rights, or, you know, whether it's something civic or, you know, more hobbyish or spiritual or leadership, or, you know, but because segregation and residential segregation especially still exists, I think you really have to make sort of an effort. It doesn't necessarily happen. It's not the person next door necessarily because of residential segregation. So you have to kind of make an effort. But once you do, you know, it just can be so rewarding. And that's
Yeah.
how I've learned so much over the decades, by making friends who are friends for decades,
Right.
through organizations, because it's one of the best ways to make friends.
Okay. All
I want
right.
to say, not all Black people want to be around white people, and in fact, it can be traumatic for a white person to introduce themselves into a space where Black people would rather be among other Black people. And
Right,
I want to encourage
right.
us all, myself included, to not take that personally, but to recognize that as a legacy of centuries of harmful and fatal white supremacy mythology. When I say white
Right.
supremacy mythology, I don't mean that white supremacy isn't real. I
Right.
mean that it's not true that white people are superior.
Right. Right.
So I want to say tomorrow, I usually, as I said, I don't usually have two events back to back, but tomorrow there's going to be an Ask Me Anything with Cleo Monago. He doesn't like me call him Dr. Cleo Monago. He has been, to me, the most influential person of African descent in shaping my views around this. And so I'm just going to put the link here, and you can go straight there. There's no registration needed. I think that's the right link. I think it's the one I gave you mistakenly for today's. So I want to make sure I got that in there before. But I just want to say, Joan, thank you so much for this. If you have not read this book, I really encourage you all to go out there and get this book, Loving Before Loving.
Can you
A
put
marriage.
the link in the chat? Can you put the link?
I did earlier. Maybe
Did
I
you?
didn't. David, can you look that up? Loving Before Loving, A Marriage in Black and White by Joan Lester, and put that while I say a few more things. So I would say, you know, Joan has written so many other things, including Black, White, Other, that she mentioned. Also, The Future of White Men and Other Diversity Dilemmas. What a great title. And she wrote a biography of Eleanor Holmes Norton. And she mentioned, she also talks about Eleanor and a lot in the book. You could see the background of their relationship. And there's a few others too. You're welcome to mention, Joe, but I just wanted to say, thank you so much. What a delight to be able to have you here and see you after all of these years. And thank you all for coming. And
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting, Jill, and
welcome.
thank you everyone for, you know, participating. It was, and for your comments. It was really a great discussion, and I really appreciate everybody's thoughtfulness.
Is it okay if I put you on my mailing list? Just tell me.
I'm already on it.
Oh, you're already on it. Okay. Not you, Joan, but I could. I'll just send you more stuff like this if you want for the future. You can always opt out.
Are you talking to all of us or?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you can easily opt out.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
I'll stay on for another minute or two if you want to ask me about my future programs or anything else.
Bye. Nice meeting you.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye. Joyce, did you have a question?
No, I was going to just say, I didn't know whether you were still on or not.
I'm still here.
Oh, that's good. All right. How long does that last?